Power and corruption are two sides of a wicked coin. Welcome to the podcast that tells stories of the world's largest, most salacious corruption scandals and explores the myriad ways corruption creeps into the hearts and minds of men and women, the consequences of corruption for perpetrators and victims, and the red flags that, had they been identified and addressed, might have changed the course of history. I'm Tatiana Sainati, and I'm joined today by my co-host,
Diana Shaw,
and our excellent story developer,
Fab Patria.
We are lawyers at the DC-based law firm Wiley Ryan. I'm the co-head of our International Arbitration and Disputes Group. Diana is a partner in our white-collar crimes practice. And Fab is an associate in our government contracts group. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We are back after a brief hiatus. I hope everyone's 2025 is off to a good start. I know that we have a lot of excellent stories about people behaving badly to share with our listeners this year.
That we do.
So I'm excited to dive into our scandal today, guys. We're going to be talking about General Sani Abacha. He came to power in Nigeria in a coup in 1993, at a time when military coups were the most realistic and effective method of regime change in that country. And he ended up ruling until his death in 1998. It's described by one author as having Pinochet's ruthlessness, Mobutu's kleptocratic streak, and the mystique of Putin.
Wow, that's a trifecta.
That is a trifecta indeed, yes.
Quite the personality.
His former superior described him as a man of very limited words. He doesn't talk a lot. You can't predict him. And he maintained a veil of secrecy reflected in a pair of dark sunglasses that he was known to wear day and night, inside and out. This man ended up embezzling at least $3 billion from the Nigerian people.
Whoa.
Yes. Together with his sons Ibrahim and Mohammed and several associates. These exploits landed him in the coveted number 4 spot on Forbes' list of the all-time most corrupt leaders.
Coveted. I'm just dying to know who 1, 2, and 3 are.
I mean, I'm sure we'll be covering them.
If we haven't already.
In 1993, shortly before the coup that brought him to power, Sani Abacha was the defense minister and the most senior military official of the Third Nigerian Republic. And he orchestrated a coup to throw out an interim government, which was ostensibly in place to try and install the first ever democratically elected, or I should say first democratically elected post-independence president. And he presented this coup as an act of stability to mitigate the socio and political uncertainties of the 1992 presidential election, which was only not effective because of the military itself. So a little bit of specious logic there, but he controlled the military, so he could do what he wanted. In 1994, so 1 year after he takes power, he places himself above the jurisdiction of the courts and gives himself absolute power through a presidential decree, which you could think of sort of like an executive order. And he followed that action with a decree giving himself the right to detain anyone for up to 3 months without trial.
What basis did he proclaim for seizing these powers? Did he claim there was some sort of national emergency?
Yes, indeed.
Okay.
He liked to call on the national emergency and national security power, which, as we'll see, he did quite liberally in order to enrich himself, but also to seize all of this power for himself.
And was there a mounted challenge against him?
Potentially. So right at the very beginning of his regime, right in the 1993, a little bit into 1994, he alleged that there was a massive conspiracy against him perpetrated by or orchestrated by the man who had actually been elected in a landslide victory president in the 1992 presidential election, a man named Mr. Abiola, who was the wealthiest man in the African continent at the time, a multi-billionaire, as well as several other former military officials and former leaders of the country. And he put all of them in jail. There was not even necessarily evidence that they were acting against him, but they were certainly the ones in the country who could have.
So he has them all rounded up. They're all in custody in prison, and yet they are still the basis for a declaration of a national emergency and the seizing of basically absolute power. Okay.
In addition to some of these military officials and former leaders. He also imprisoned several members of the media. So really members of the opposition. So really anyone who could have been an effective voice against him, he moved pretty quickly to silence them or to scare them into silence. Ultimately, he wound up in one particularly grisly episode having 8 or 9 members of an environmental group tried and executed.
Oh my God.
And that got Nigeria kicked out of the Commonwealth of Nations.
Oh, wow.
Yes. Not a great guy. I mean, we did start off by saying Pinochet's ruthlessness about his kleptocratic streak and the mystique of Putin.
He's living up to
it. He is living up to it. He was very paranoid. And he had assembled a 3,000-person strong personal security force trained in North Korea. And he installed one of his sycophants as the chief of security, who also had an iron grip on military security. So this is partly why I think he was able to do as much as he was, is he had this basically a small private army that was willing to die for him and had been extremely well trained. And those who crossed him had a tendency to end up in custody or dead. So in addition to ruling his country with an iron fist and seizing absolute power, he tried to enrich himself absolutely. Nigeria is a very wealthy country, as I'm sure you guys know. It has a ton of oil wealth, and I think 70 to 80% of their GDP at the time came from oil. And General Abacha devised several different schemes for extracting oil wealth for himself and removing it from the country. One of the schemes, he directed his national security advisor to prepare over 60 letters directing the withdrawal of funds from the Central Bank of Nigeria for security purposes. And these letters would allege various unidentified emergencies. He did this pursuant to a law that allowed governors and the president, or I guess he's not really the leader, to take out funds if necessary for a public emergency. They were able to get the Central Bank of Nigeria to hand over cash. For example, one letter requested $100 million to combat an economy that was deflected and distorted through the black market. I don't know what that means, so please don't ask.
Okay, we won't.
And I don't know why you need $100 million in cash to fix that particular emergency. But that's the type of thing that they're putting into these letters. They're getting the money from the bank.
And I'm just going to assume that there's zero paper trail after the cash is received to show how that money was spent or what it went to.
Well, there's a little bit of a paper trail.
Oh, okay.
Yes. I mean, they were pretty brazen in country. So he would literally have like a truck come and they would load the truck up with cash from the bank. They would move it to the house of his national security advisor. He'd repackage it. I'm not sure why at that point. He'd repackage it, deliver the cash to the general. And the general would then give the money to his son, his eldest son, in bags or in boxes. And his son, Muhammad, and another family friend would then deposit that same cash in commercial bank accounts in Nigeria. So they're going from the central bank to these commercial banks. And then they would direct that money to be transferred to accounts in the name of shell corporations that they controlled overseas. And then from there, they would move it and move it and move it. They often laundered it actually through U.S.-backed government bonds.
Oh,
yes.
It's not great.
Yeah, no, it's not. In another scheme, he caused Nigeria to repurchase debt from itself at twice the price Nigeria would have paid to repurchase it on the open market.
Oh.
Yes. That got him $282 million. He died in 1998 before he spent any of this money, really.
Oh, so
I mean, I'm sure he
spent
was,
years accruing it?
Just spent years accruing it. He didn't go out and build himself one of those lavish zoos or have golden toilets or anything.
As far as we know.
As far as we know. But no, most of the loot, he died before he was actually able to really spend it. The official cause of death was a heart attack, but there's pretty credible reports, including from some U.S. agencies, that he might have actually been poisoned while being entertained by 3 prostitutes at the home of a senior Nigerian official.
Oh.
Yes.
See? Your vices get you in trouble in more ways than one.
And some U.S. agencies speculated that the source of the poison was a military officer or a military clique that was concerned about the reputation that he was giving to the military. So the Nigerian military, despite having controlled the country through a series of coups, essentially since independence and certainly since Nigerian Civil War, really believed in itself as a force for good and for stability in the country. And so there was a lot of internal turmoil and struggle, I think, with some of Abacha's more obvious exploits, transporting truckloads of cash around and executing your opposition.
He was not on brand.
He was not on brand. He was not on brand. He was a little too brazen. His death sparked an international treasure hunt. Now, they haven't been able to recover everything, and it took decades to do this. But indeed, in September 1999, so shortly after his death, about a year after his death, the Swiss lawyer named Enrico Manfrini, who did a lot of work in Nigeria, mostly with private clients, was contacted by a senior Nigerian official and asked if he could help find and return the money, much of which Nigeria had been able to trace to Swiss bank accounts. Mr. Manfrini convinced the Swiss authorities that the Abacha family and their associates were a criminal organization. So that was the key to kind of unlocking the mystery. Once he made the compelling case that this was a criminal enterprise, it prevented the banks from using as cover the idea of privacy, prevented the banks from kind of hiding behind any of those rules about the confidentiality of client information. So it opened up more investigative opportunities. The Swiss Attorney General told all Swiss banks to disclose the existence of any accounts opened in the names of the Abachas or any of their aliases. Within 2 days, 95% of banks in Switzerland declared assets that belonged to the family.
Oh, wow.
Yes. And that led to a web of bank accounts all over the world.
Extensive coverage.
Extensive coverage, yes. Wow. Eventually, banks in Switzerland, Jersey, not New Jersey, but Jersey, part of the UK, Liechtenstein, the United States, and the UK returned assets to Nigeria. I think they're still trying to get some assets in France. Switzerland wound up returning about $1 billion to the government in 2002. The U.S. Department of Justice also aided in the efforts to return the loot. That was through a 2014 civil forfeiture case filed right here in the D.C. federal court, which uncovered more than $625 million in assets traceable to the Abacha clan. The $3 billion that Sani Abacha stole is just a small fraction of the total wealth that Nigeria's leaders have taken from the country. The New York Times reported that at least $400 billion is believed to have been stolen or misspent by the government, mostly in the form of profits from the country's oil reserves.
Oh, my God.
And that trend has sadly continued. President Olusegun Obasanjo came to office after Abacha's death. He was the next actually democratically elected leader of the country, and he ratcheted up pressure on the fight against corruption. He's the one who got in touch with I don't think he personally, but directed that they would get in touch with the Swiss government and the American government and try and trace these assets. He embroiled numerous high officials in criminal investigations in the early to mid-aughts. The Inspector General of Police was charged with stealing $140 million. The president of the Senate was forced from office for taking a bribe from the education minister to pass an inflated budget. In 2005, in one of the more lurid, I guess, tales to come from the country, Governor Dipriye Alamasiga, which I probably butchered, fled Nigeria in a dress and a wig to avoid money laundering charges. Yes. He was suspected
out of a movie,
right? He was suspected of siphoning millions of dollars in cash. He bought an oil refinery for himself in Ecuador, houses around the world. He was arrested in London, released on bail, but forced to surrender his passport. And then he just turned up in his home state of Bayelsa in Nigeria, where he told supporters, "I cannot tell you how I was brought here. It is a mystery. All the glory goes to God." His lawyer confirmed that story and said all he would tell me is that God brought him home. Now, why would he want to go home? Well, as I mentioned, he's one of Nigeria's governors. Nigerian governors enjoy immunity from prosecution under the Constitution of Nigeria. They can theoretically be impeached, but they generally retain power despite the hypothetical availability of impeachment because they control the state money and they generally control the legislatures that might otherwise impeach them. So, kind of a question of how effective of a tool is impeachment. And to this day, the immunity provision in the Nigerian constitution gives governors who control these exorbitant budgets total immunity from prosecution.
Has that been revisited in more recent years?
I mean, I found a lot of think pieces and essays online talking about why it's problematic, but nothing officially, no official movement to actually change those particular provisions.
It's interesting, as you were telling the story, I was starting to think about corollaries with past episodes with Ukraine and Brazil and institutionalized crime. This feels a little different. It feels more like an individualized free-for-all as opposed to sort of a coordinated system of graft and corruption. Yes. Is that your read on the situation?
Exactly. I think that's exactly right. And one of the things that is interesting about it is a totally different way of going about the corruption scandal. There is no system of oligarchs or a system of embedded institutionalized corruption, and yet it's clearly a widespread problem, but on a person by person scale, just people trying to take what they can.
And yet the people at the top seem to be turning a blind eye, if not participating in it themselves. So there's some sort of coordination going on, but it's more tacit, I guess, than in some of the other places where it seemed more organized and embedded in the institutions.
Yeah, exactly.
And is it your sense that the new leadership that's come in and pushed more of an anti-corruption platform, are they able to move the needle? Obviously, they've been able to recover a lot of wealth for the country, but any kind of systemic change?
They've actually become a case study for the World Bank in how you can successfully trace assets and why it is so important to have the cooperation of the government from which the assets were stolen if you're going to be successful in those attempts. And one of the interesting points, perhaps, is that for both the United States and the Swiss authorities, there were strings attached to how the money would be earmarked and spent when it went back to the country, because there were significant concerns about the money being re-corrupted or not put back to a public purpose. Unfortunately, I think I mentioned President Olusegun Obasanjo was a reformer. I think he ruled until about 2015. I could be slightly off on that, but there has not been quite the same push from every administration or from all officials. And there has been a real appreciable difference in the level of corruption depending on who is in office.
Well, I think we've seen, if you really want to tackle corruption, it has to be part of a long-term plan with long-term investment, and it requires an entire infrastructure that has to be built often over decades, through legislation, within government, through civil society. And so the idea that one leader can take it on kind of term by term, we'll see then it's just sort of fits and starts. And so while totally admirable that some of the leaders have pushed harder, I can understand why you might not see some of the longer term effects that you would hope for when really trying to tackle an issue like this.
So now it's time for that part of the episode where we talk about some of the red flags that we saw and how the world might have been set on a different trajectory had they been identified earlier. Diana, any thoughts?
I mean, to be honest with you, this whole story is one big red flag, right? Hostile takeover, military coup. It's as red as the red flags get. But I think one of the things that really jumped out to me was just the lack of checks and balances. Whenever an individual is able to seize power and then take so much control over government such that they essentially can't be challenged, you do have to wonder what were the lacks in the checks and balances that allowed that to happen. Now, it's by force, the systemic checks and balances aren't necessarily going to help you there, but that's why checks and balances exist, to be that safeguard in instances like that, so that not one person, not one arm of the government can ever become too powerful.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And what it brings to mind for me in terms of this particular story is, as I mentioned, I think because of some of his antics is probably putting it far too mildly, but because of the dictatorial way, the tyrannical way in which he was ruling things, the Commonwealth of Nations kicked Nigeria out. And I think that had real ramifications. I mean, as I mentioned, the hot goss that seems pretty legitimate is that the military might have orchestrated Abacha's demise because they were worried about the reputation that they were developing domestically and internationally. And so those checks and balances can come from a variety of sources, and concern about reputation, concern about like what are going to come from allowing this type of behavior to go unchecked is maybe a soft check and balance.
Yeah, well, I think it's a good point that you don't have to just look at the systemic checks and balances, right? Having a strong civil society, having a strong free media, these are also important checks and balances. And so ideally, you want all of those working together at the same time to keep something like this from happening. But even when something as horrific as this does happen, you can be surprised where there are these soft checks that can sometimes come about. Not that we're condoning any kind of assassination plots or anything like that, but, yeah.
Another red flag, I guess, that struck me, and it's related to the checks and balances, but is this notion of immunity. So when you have the governors, for example, in Nigeria with absolute immunity under the Constitution, which has led to them pilfering from the states that they govern, when you have the absolute immunity for General Abacha, the freedom that gives those immune individuals to kind of do whatever they want to do with impunity. And I think it's a tricky question, right? Because there are absolutely reasons why you want to make sure that government officials do not feel like they're going to be prosecuted for making unpopular decisions when those decisions are, especially in hindsight, appear less reasonable than they did at the moment that they were made. But on the other hand, having this sense of immunity for unlawful acts seems like it proved quite problematic and is continuing to prove quite problematic in the country.
I think that's right. And I think it's an issue that many countries have grappled with for exactly the reasons that you've said. Having been a government official, making decisions often without much time to make them and on the basis of limited information, you sort of know, even in the moment, that in hindsight, someone might have decided differently. And so you want a certain amount of grace for those moments and for those decisions. But I think the immunity question is a hard one. How do you draw the line between what is an official act and what isn't? And in most instances, the legislature or the body that's going to be deciding what that line is, they're going to be judged by it too, right? And so there may be this sort of incentive not to necessarily draw that line too clearly, because if you ever end up in the crosshairs and being analyzed with that criteria, you sort of hope that it works in your favor. So it doesn't surprise me that they drew the line where they did, but it seems to me any reasonable person could look at some of these acts and say they probably weren't official acts. They definitely seem like they crossed over into the personal, at least in some instances.
Yes.
Sort of tied to the immunity question and what kind of criteria you use to differentiate when one should have immunity and not. One of the points that came up in the story was the use of emergency powers to seize a lot of control, which then created the platform by which he was able to steal so many of the country's assets. I think that's another really tricky area where it's often not well defined what should constitute an emergency. It's left to the leader to decide. And I think there's really good reason why you wouldn't want to be too prescriptive, but there's also this sort of understanding, or at least I think there's this expectation anyway that the leader is not going to abuse that authority. And so then, of course, when you have someone who's not operating the way that you expect them to, it gives them enormous power to, unfortunately, basically take over an entire country very quickly.
Yeah. Another one that jumped out at me is the role of the banks in all of this. Obviously, that is what facilitated or enabled the flow of Nigerian money out of the country and into the Abacha's private accounts, was by being able to leverage the international banking system. And I know we touched briefly on the fact that Switzerland had passed a law to make their banks more accountable and more compliant with investigations, precisely because there were so many instances in which the Swiss banks were identified as holding accounts in the names of some pretty infamous world leaders and dictators. And maybe one of our episodes down the line will end up covering more explicitly scandals involving banks, but I do think this notion of knowing your customers, some level of diligence, obviously that's never going to be perfect. And obviously with banks too, there's a reason why you need a certain degree of confidentiality and protection for your customers. But at what point do you need to make sure that you're not aiding and abetting scandalous behavior?
Indeed. And I think we're seeing kind of an evolution here, certainly at the early part of our story, when our story began. The views on how involved banks should be in terms of due diligence were different than they are now. I think we're seeing less appetite in the public and certainly within law enforcement for banks to simply say, well, it's not really our responsibility to know who's putting money in our banks or where the money came from. With anti-money laundering laws and a lot of international cooperation around really trying to ensure that banks aren't misused for purposes of money laundering and other kind of illicit financial transactions, we're starting to see, I think, maybe a little bit of a tipping point where that's not as accepted. And it opens up a lot of incredible opportunities for asset recovery, especially for some of these nations that have for decades, and many cases generations, seen the wealth of their country sadly removed through the corrupt acts of their leaders.
And I think that actually segues beautifully into what is not a red flag, but heartening from my perspective in this episode of, well, what happens when the government does decide to take action and say, we want to investigate what happened here and we want to get back what was lost? And so for me, it was interesting to cover one of these stories where the government has just done a tremendous job and to your point, enabled to a significant extent by cooperation from other governments, and especially governments that have, significant presence in the financial and banking sectors, but enabled by that international cooperation to actually recover so much of these assets for the people and to return it, and to try and return it in a structured way in which the money is now doing what it was supposed to have done all along, which is benefit the people of Nigeria.
Yeah, the international cooperation piece is interesting, and that is, I think, a heartening trend. I think we're seeing increased international cooperation. I know, looking at foreign bribery, there's such great cooperation right now between the US, the UK, France, Switzerland. There's real effort there. And so I think that opens up all sorts of opportunities to really maybe move the needle on some of this. But it's such a huge task for some of these countries, and it really takes the will of the government. And so you have to have the right set of leaders willing to open up their books, make information accessible, and work with international partners if you want to see the sorts of outcomes that we saw here.
Well, this scandal had, as usual, a lot more to it than we were able to cover today. So we'll be posting some additional information in the show notes, including some really fantastic books, both on Nigerian history and the Abacha era in general, and also a fantastic book by Enrico Manfrini, the Swiss lawyer who was engaged on behalf of the government to find Nigeria's stolen billions, called Recovering Lost Assets. Until then, I want to thank our listeners for joining us for today's episode and invite you back next month when we will be sharing another salacious story of corruption. Diana, any teasers for next month's episode?
I'm going to make you wait.
All right. If you like this podcast, please let us know by liking us on whatever listening platform you use, and maybe even sharing us with your friends, family, or anyone you know who, like us, loves a good story about people behaving badly. In the meantime, be good, and we'll see you next month.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.